My name is Ava Carter, and at just 24, I never imagined that the most powerful moment of my life would unfold beneath the bright lights of a university graduation ceremony in Boulder, Colorado. Standing next to my younger sister, Brooke, in matching caps and gowns, anyone looking at us would have seen a picture-perfect family moment. But the truth beneath that smile, beneath every step that led to that stage, was anything but perfect. What I carried inside was years of buried hurt, of being overlooked, of having to fight for every inch of ground while she was handed the path. Before I share what happened that made my parents' faces turn ghost white in front of hundreds of guests, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had to work twice as hard for something someone else was simply given, please hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe for more journeys like mine. That day, graduation day, was supposed to be a celebration. But for me, it became something more. It became quiet, unmistakable revenge. Not revenge in the bitter sense, but in the way that truth, when finally spoken out loud, becomes undeniable. I remember standing in line, hearing the names called out, one by one. My heart thudded not because I was nervous to walk the stage, but because I knew what was coming after. I knew what was planned, and I knew that everything my parents believed about me was about to crumble in public. You see, to them, Brooke was always the one worth investing in. She was the one with the charm, the praise, the parties, the private tutoring. And me? I was the one they assumed would be fine on my own, the one who didn't need much. But they were wrong. So wrong. They didn't see the cost of being constantly overlooked, the slow erosion of self-worth, the countless nights I stared at ceilings wondering what I had to do to be seen. That moment on stage, it was years in the making. Every job I worked, every scholarship I hunted, every night I stayed up studying until my eyes burned, it all led here. And now, standing beside the sister who never once had to wonder how her tuition would be paid, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Quiet, steady, earned power. The applause that day wasn't just for academic success. It was for survival, for persistence, for becoming everything they said I couldn't be without ever asking for their permission. And yet, as the ceremony continued, as the chancellor's voice echoed across the stadium, I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who's ever been told they were the backup plan, the safety net, the one who'd figure it out somehow. What came next? What made my parents' smiles falter and their eyes widen was only the beginning of what would unfold. But to understand the weight of that moment, you need to see where it all started. You need to see the cracked foundation beneath the picture-perfect house with blue shutters and trimmed hedges. The small town in northern Colorado, where reputations mattered more than relationships. And a family that prided itself on appearances, no matter what it cost those of us behind closed doors. So let me take you back, not just to the beginning, but to the root. Because this story isn't just about proving people wrong. It's about reclaiming your voice when it was never invited into the room to begin with. And believe me, that voice is just getting started. What began under the spotlight of that graduation stage didn't start in college. It started much earlier, in the quiet corners of my childhood home, the one with the green shutters on Maple Street in Evergreen, Colorado. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where everything made sense. Clean lawn, porch swing, holiday lights in December. But behind the curtains was a family held together by image, not intimacy. My parents, Daniel and Karen Carter, were both solid people by town standards. Dad was a financial advisor, always dressed in pressed slacks and a watch he'd polish on Sunday mornings. Mom taught at the local middle school, language arts, of all things. The irony isn't lost on me now, how she could teach a room full of kids about empathy in novels, but fail to notice the loneliness blooming in her own daughter. From a very early age, there was a divide that I couldn't name but deeply felt. Brooke, my younger sister by 2 years, seemed to effortlessly match their expectations. She had sun-kissed hair, quick charm, and the kind of effortless confidence that made people want to cheer for her. I loved her, but I also noticed the pattern long before I had words to define it. She got praise, I got instructions. She got private piano lessons, I got, "Be patient, Ava." When Brooke got a scraped knee, Dad would carry her inside like a porcelain doll. When I did, I was told to shake it off. "You're tougher than her." Christmas mornings were the earliest signs that something was off. Year after year, she'd unwrap electronics, designer jackets, things she mentioned once in passing. I'd get books, always educational, or sweaters 2 sizes too big. "You're practical," Mom would say with a smile, as if that explained everything. At school, the difference deepened. I remember my 5th grade science fair where I stayed up for 3 nights building a display on renewable energy. I stood there in a homemade shirt with facts written in Sharpie while Mom picked Brooke up early to get her hair done for a dance recital. She didn't come to see my project, didn't even ask how it went. Dad? He once told me that art and emotions were distractions. "Focus on what gets you ahead, Ava. Feelings won't pay the bills." I didn't know then how much that would stick, or sting, but not everyone ignored me. Grandma June, Dad's mother, was my refuge. She lived in a small cottage 2 hours away, near the edge of Pike National Forest. Every summer, I'd spend weeks with her, wandering through the wildflowers, sketching the shapes of trees, and listening to her stories about women who built legacies from scraps. "You see things other people don't," she'd whisper, tracing my pencil lines with her wrinkled finger. "Don't ever let them tell you that makes you less. It makes you rare." Those summers were everything. In that old house that smelled like cinnamon and cedar, I felt more myself than I ever did back home. Her shelves were lined with books about women in business, civil rights leaders, artists who forged paths despite rejection. I devoured those stories like they were food, because in a way, they were. Back in Evergreen, though, reality always returned. I kept my head down, earned good grades, and stopped expecting applause. I learned that invisibility wasn't just possible, it could be survival. If they didn't see me, they couldn't be disappointed in me. But something inside me kept pushing. Even when ignored, I wanted to be seen. Even when dismissed, I wanted to matter. So I started building quietly. At 12, I entered a local essay contest and won 2nd place. No one came to the award ceremony. At 14, I organized a fundraiser for a local shelter. Dad said it was a nice gesture, but reminded me not to let it affect my GPA. Every time I reached for more, they pulled me back with politeness, smiles that masked the disbelief. I was the kid who had to make do. The one they assumed would land on her feet, because I always had. But here's the thing they never understood. Just because someone manages doesn't mean they don't need support. And just because someone stays quiet doesn't mean they're not screaming inside. Those early years shaped everything. They sharpened my vision and deepened my hunger, not for revenge, but for recognition, for something solid, for a future I could build with my own hands, even if no one handed me the bricks. And so by the time high school rolled around, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing, because something in me knew I'd have to earn every inch of my future, on my own. And I was ready to start. By the time I started high school, the lines were already drawn, not in bold declarations, but in quiet, consistent choices. Choices that told me where I stood in my own family. I'd stopped hoping for fairness by then. What I wanted was just a chance. A moment where I could prove I wasn't just the capable one, but someone worth investing in. So I leaned into what I could control. Evergreen High offered a business club that met on Tuesdays after school, small, low profile, mostly juniors and seniors. I signed up without telling anyone. At 15, I was the youngest in the group, but I soaked up every session like oxygen. Marketing, budgeting, entrepreneurship. I couldn't get enough. It felt like finding a doorway into the kind of life Grandma June always said I was meant for. Meanwhile, Brooke joined the school's theater program and, as expected, quickly became its rising star. Lead roles, glowing write-ups in the local newspaper, parents bringing flowers after every performance. I remember watching one of her plays from the back row. When she came out to take her bow, our parents stood and clapped like she'd just won a Tony. I sat quietly, hands in my lap, trying to feel proud without letting the ache win. But I was building something, quietly, steadily. By sophomore year, I'd been promoted to treasurer of the business club, managing our fundraising efforts and balancing our modest budget. When our advisor suggested we enter the State High School Business Innovation Challenge, I volunteered to lead our team. It was the first time I truly stepped into something with stakes. Real ones. We spent weeks developing a pitch for a digital platform, connecting local artisans to tourists in mountain towns, something uniquely Colorado. I designed the financial model, marketing plan, and presentation slides myself. On competition day, we took home second place statewide. It felt electric. Our advisor, Mr. Halpern, was so proud he called my parents that evening. I watched from the living room as Mom spoke on the phone, her face expressionless. When she hung up, she looked at me and simply said, "That's nice, Ava. Don't forget your sister needs help editing her scholarship essay tonight." It wasn't a cruel tone. It wasn't even dismissive on purpose. It was worse. It was indifferent. That kind of dismissal didn't sting like a slap. It hollowed you out slowly. The kind of ache that whispers, "No matter what you do, you'll always be second," and not because you failed, but because they never even looked. So I doubled down. I started working weekends at a local cafe on Main Street, saving every paycheck. I knew even then I'd have to fund my future myself. I kept my GPA near perfect, tutored younger students, and took on every extra credit assignment I could. It wasn't just about grades. It was about building armor. Armor made of achievements. Achievements no one could take from me, even if they never acknowledged them. Meanwhile, Brooke was being courted by colleges before junior year even ended. Campus tours, SAT prep classes, customized counseling sessions, all paid for without hesitation. I found an SAT prep book at a thrift store and studied during my lunch breaks. It wasn't jealousy. It was the realization that in their eyes, one of us was a sure bet. The other was a gamble they weren't willing to back. Still, I didn't stop. Because somewhere between the cafe shifts and club meetings, a seed had been planted. Not just the desire to succeed, but the fierce, burning need to be seen. And if they weren't going to do it, then I'd make the world notice. One step, one plan, one goal at a time. That goal became clearer as senior year approached, and so did the challenge that would shake everything I thought I'd prepared for. College was always the goal. Not just because it was expected, but because it was my shot, the shot, at rewriting what had always felt predetermined. So, as senior year at Evergreen High rolled in like the first heavy snow, I sharpened my focus even further. I studied harder, worked longer shifts at the cafe, and mapped out my college applications like a general preparing for war. Westbridge University had always been the dream. A mid-sized, competitive school tucked just outside Denver, known for its entrepreneurship program and strong business faculty. When I toured the campus junior year, alone, because my parents were helping Brooke get ready for a theater showcase, I fell in love with the place. The energy, the ambition, the quiet hum of possibility. I could picture myself there, building something real, something that belonged entirely to me. But as it turned out, Brooke had her eye on Westbridge too. She'd recently taken an interest in political science after being voted student body president. Of course, our parents loved the idea. Leadership potential, they said. Big future. We both applied in the fall. Both received our acceptance letters on the same day. I remember mine arriving in a thick white envelope, the kind you dream about. My hands shook as I opened it, rereading the words, "Congratulations," over and over. I burst into the kitchen, barely containing the adrenaline. "I got in," I said. "Full acceptance into the School of Business." Dad looked up from his phone briefly. "That's nice, Ava." Then he turned back to his screen. Not 5 minutes later, Brooke came flying through the front door, shrieking like she'd won the lottery. "I got in too! Westbridge's School of Public Affairs!" The shift in the room was immediate. Dad leapt from his chair. Mom wrapped her in a dramatic hug. Within minutes, the dining room was transformed into an impromptu celebration. Champagne glasses, takeout menus, music playing from Dad's old speaker. No one asked me to stay. No one remembered I had been accepted, too. I sat quietly at the corner of the table, my letter clutched in my lap, watching them toast to her future, as if mine hadn't just arrived, too. 2 weeks later, we had dinner together as a family. A rare event, complete with roast chicken and real napkins. About halfway through the meal, Dad cleared his throat and said, "We need to talk about college funding." I straightened instinctively. I'd been dying to know how they planned to handle 2 kids in school. Surely they'd saved something. But he never looked at me. Only at Brooke. "We've been saving for your education since you were little," he said to her. "We want you to be able to focus on school without worrying about money." Brooke lit up, eyes wide with relief. I waited, silent, assuming my turn was next. It wasn't. Finally, I asked, "And what about me?" The pause that followed was the longest 5 seconds of my life. Dad shifted uncomfortably. "Ava, we only have enough to fully fund one of you, and Brooke's always shown strong leadership potential. We think the return on that investment is more defined." Mom reached over, patted my hand like I was a child who'd just lost a game. "You've always been independent, honey. You'll figure it out. There are loans, maybe even a local option?" That moment shattered something in me that I didn't even know was breakable. It wasn't just that they chose Brooke. It was that they never even saw it as a choice. That my years of effort, my competitions, my jobs, my grades, had meant so little, they weren't even considered. That night, I didn't cry in front of them. I waited until the house was quiet. Then I sat on the floor of my room, stared at my acceptance letter, and let the silence swallow me whole. But here's the thing about rejection when you've already spent your whole life being overlooked. It doesn't stop you. It ignites you. And by the next morning, I had made up my mind. If they wouldn't invest in me, I'd invest in myself. And I would do it so well, so completely, that they wouldn't just regret their choice. They'd remember it. Forever. All those years of working quietly in the background had led me to this moment, senior year, the final stretch before life split in 2 directions, one I could choose and one I'd be forced into. And I wasn't about to let anyone else decide my future for me. I applied to Westbridge University early. It was ambitious, competitive, expensive, but it also had one of the best entrepreneurship programs in the state. Tucked into the hills near Denver, the campus felt alive with possibility. I'd toured it alone that summer, paying for the gas with cafe tips, walking those stone paths while other families posed for photos. I didn't take pictures. I took mental notes. I didn't want a souvenir. I wanted an entrance. Brooke had her eyes on Westbridge too, only she didn't have to worry about tuition or logistics or whether anyone would back her. Our parents were already researching housing options and meal plans for her while I was digging through scholarship databases during my lunch breaks. We both received our acceptance letters on the same Friday afternoon in November. I opened mine in the parking lot of the cafe after a long shift. The letter was thick, that kind of envelope, and I tore it open with trembling fingers. I had gotten in, full admission to the School of Business. I sat in my beat-up Honda, staring at those words, letting them sink into my bones like warmth after a blizzard. When I got home, dinner had already started. I held the letter in both hands like it was made of glass. "I got into Westbridge," I announced quietly. "Business school." Dad looked up from his plate. "That's nice, Ava," he said. "Pass the potatoes?" I stood there for a second, letter still raised, then slowly sat down. Not 5 minutes later, the front door burst open. Brooke came in squealing, waving her envelope. "Guess what? Westbridge accepted me too. Political science program." And just like that, everything changed. Chairs scraped back, glasses were raised, music came on, and within 20 minutes we were having an impromptu celebration. Balloons from the hall closet, sparkling cider, our parents beaming like Christmas came early. Not once did anyone mention that I'd been accepted too. I watched from the edge of the living room as they toasted to her future, my letter still folded neatly in my lap. 2 weeks later, during one of those rare family dinners, Dad set his fork down and cleared his throat. "We need to talk about college funding," he said, looking at Brooke, not me. He smiled and reached across the table. "We've been saving for this since you were little. We want you to start your next chapter without financial stress." Brooke teared up. Mom was already nodding. "It's all taken care of," she said. "We've got tuition, housing, books, everything." I waited for my turn. It never came. "What about me?" I asked softly. The pause was so sharp it could have cut through bone. Dad glanced at me, uncomfortable. "Ava, we've had to make some hard decisions. We only have enough savings for one of you. And Brooke's always had a clearer path." "Clearer path?" I repeated, barely keeping my voice steady. "You've always been resourceful," Mom added. "We just figured you'd find your way. Like I was a weed and Brooke was a garden, one worth planting in, the other just expected to grow wherever she landed." I excused myself from the table before the tears came. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my acceptance letter. All that work, all those hours, everything I'd built, and still, I was invisible to them. But something shifted in me. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just made a promise to myself. If they weren't going to believe in me, I'd believe harder. If they weren't going to fund me, I'd fund myself. And when the time came, I wouldn't just graduate. I'd rise, so high they'd have no choice but to look up. The morning after that dinner, I woke up with swollen eyes and a steel spine. No one was going to hand me a future. I'd have to earn every inch of it. And not just with grades or effort, but with sheer grit. While my parents were printing out financial aid paperwork for Brooke, I was sitting at my tiny desk in the corner of my bedroom, building a new life from scratch. I started with the numbers. Westbridge tuition, fees, rent, books, groceries, gas. I built a spreadsheet that would become my survival guide. Then I opened 20 tabs in my browser and began applying for every scholarship, grant, and work-study program I could find. Some were tiny, $250 here, $500 there, but I didn't care. Every dollar was one less I'd owe. After school, I met with Mrs. Callahan, my guidance counselor. She listened, really listened, as I laid it all out. When I told her my parents weren't contributing anything, her face tightened. But she didn't offer pity, she offered help. "You're one of the most determined students I've seen in 20 years," she said, placing a hand over mine. "Let's make this happen." Over the next month, we worked together late after school, filling out the FAFSA, state aid applications, and niche scholarship essays for obscure foundations. I was juggling all of it while still working weekends at the cafe and keeping up with classes. Sleep became a luxury. But I had a goal, and goals have a way of making pain feel like purpose. I started to get small wins. A $1,000 Community Leadership Award, a $750 Women in Business grant. Every time I opened one of those envelopes, I didn't feel pride. I felt momentum, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, someone out there saw what my parents didn't. Still, it wasn't enough. Westbridge's price tag was steep. I needed more. So I did something I hadn't wanted to do. I drove to Grandma June's house. She opened the door in her worn sweater, her silver hair pulled back in a braid, and before I could even speak, she pulled me into a hug. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just stood there and let myself breathe for the first time in weeks. Over tea, I told her everything about the acceptance, about the dinner, about the silence. Her face didn't twist in shock, just sorrow, and then something harder, resolve. My darling, she said, her voice steady, sometimes the people who are supposed to believe in us the most are the ones who never learn how to see us, but that doesn't make you any less worthy. She couldn't give me money. Her pension barely covered her bills. But she gave me something more valuable, her signature. She offered to co-sign a small private loan. If the bank needs someone to believe in you, they can use my name, she said, because I always have. That night, back in my room, I looked at the new numbers. Between the scholarships, the loans, and a promise of a part-time job near campus, I had enough to cover my first year. It was tight, fragile, but it was mine. While Brooke was packing with our parents, making Pinterest boards for her dorm, I was scavenging boxes from the back of grocery stores and folding secondhand clothes. She had matching bedspreads, fairy lights, and custom storage bins. I had twin sheets Mom offered from the attic, faded pink, and still smelling faintly of mothballs. On move-in day, they took her in the family SUV, blasting music and documenting every moment. I followed 2 hours later in my decade-old Honda, engine rattling the entire way. No one offered to check the car, no one offered to ride with me. As I pulled into a gravel lot behind a shabby off-campus apartment, I stared at the building. The paint was peeling, the handrail was rusted, the front door buzzed when it opened. It was nothing like Brooke's dorm, but it was mine. I lugged box after box up the narrow stairs alone. By the time I dropped the last one, sweat clung to my back and my legs ached. I sat on the floor of my new room, bare walls, mismatched curtains, and felt it hit me all at once. I wasn't just moving out. I was moving forward. Without a safety net, without applause, without backup. And that realization, as terrifying as it was, it also set me free. The first week at Westbridge University felt like stepping into someone else's story. The wide lawns, the red brick buildings, the polished hallways buzzing with confident voices. It was everything I dreamed of. But walking into it alone, on tired legs and a tight budget, made it feel more like trespassing than belonging. My apartment was 45 minutes from campus, and the only way to make it all work was with a spreadsheet tighter than my budget and a schedule that barely left room to breathe. I had 2 jobs before classes even started. One was a morning shift at Beanline Coffee, 2 blocks from campus. The other was at a small bookstore on weekends, shelving bestsellers I'd never have time to read. I stacked my classes between shifts, choosing professors with high ratings and low homework loads. Not because I didn't care, because time was the one thing I didn't have to spare. While Brooke posted dorm selfies and sorority event invites on her story, I was figuring out how to stretch pasta and peanut butter into a week's worth of meals. She called home every Sunday, chatting with Mom about study groups and parties and how college was so much fun. I, on the other hand, texted Grandma June when I could. Not to complain, but to stay grounded. She always answered, always with something simple, something strong. Keep your head high, Ava. You're not here to blend in. You're here to build. Still, the days were brutal. I'd wake up at 5:00 a.m., study for an hour, open the cafe by 6, attend classes from 9 to 3, then head straight to the bookstore or back home to finish assignments before midnight. By week 3, I'd developed the ability to type a full discussion post while eating instant oatmeal with one hand and reviewing lecture slides with the other. But underneath the exhaustion was something else: competence. I wasn't just surviving, I was learning, and not just in class. My first accounting course felt like a foreign language to most students, but I understood it deeply because I lived it. My life was a budget. Every meal, every gallon of gas, every hour of work, it all fit into a formula I'd memorized out of necessity. During a group project, my professor, Dr. Kapoor, pulled me aside after class. "Ms. Carter," he said, adjusting his glasses, "your breakdown of the case study was remarkably practical. You speak like someone who's run a business." I smiled quietly. I've had to run my life like one. He didn't laugh. He nodded, like he got it. Those moments, when someone finally saw more than just a tired girl in thrift store jeans, meant more than I could explain. I didn't need pity. I needed recognition. And slowly, it started coming. From classmates asking me for help, from professors remembering my name, from little wins, like being the first to finish a midterm or asking the right question at the right time. Still, there were nights I came home and stared at my cracked ceiling, wondering if it would all crack me next. I wasn't superhuman. I was just determined. And that's not always enough. One night, after a brutal 12-hour stretch, I collapsed onto my mattress, too tired to cry, too wired to sleep. My phone buzzed. A text from Zoe, one of my new roommates. "I made extra dinner. It's in the fridge with your name on it. Eat, then sleep. Tomorrow is another fight, and you don't have to fight it alone." That was the first time I felt it. Support. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. It wouldn't be the last. And though I didn't know it yet, Zoe's quiet kindness would soon become a lifeline in the storm I was only just beginning to navigate. For a while, I thought I had found a rhythm. The brutal early mornings, the stacked classes, the double jobs. It was a grind, sure, but it was my grind. I'd built a system, one spreadsheet and one scheduled hour at a time. Even the exhaustion started to feel familiar, like a shadow I'd learned to walk beside. But control is fragile, and it doesn't take much to break the illusion of safety. Midway through fall semester, Beanline Coffee announced they were reducing hours due to the seasonal drop in business. "We just can't justify the labor costs," the manager said, barely meeting my eyes as she handed me a revised schedule. 10 hours a week, down from 20. I did the math before I even left the store. My rent wasn't going to wait. Neither was my tuition installment. The gap left by that lost paycheck was more than just inconvenient. It was dangerous. I walked home in silence that night, my shoes soaked through from an unexpected snow. Every step felt heavier than the last. I didn't tell Zoe, not right away. I just sat on the edge of my bed staring at my cracked ceiling again, wondering if this was the moment I'd been afraid of, the moment everything I was holding up would finally collapse. But then I remembered something. Ms. Patel, the assistant director of financial aid, had told us during orientation, "If things ever get overwhelming, come see us. You're not alone." So the next morning, I showed up outside her office with my worn backpack and a tired heart. She listened, really listened. And then she leaned forward, tapping her keyboard. "Your academic record is excellent, Ava. That puts you in line for one of our emergency completion grants. It's not huge, but it could carry you through the semester." I blinked. "Seriously?" She smiled. "We don't just hand these out. You earned it. And there might be something else." That's how I ended up meeting Dr. Kapoor again, this time not as a professor, but as a mentor. He had apparently recommended me for a research assistant position in the business department. It paid more than either of my other jobs and came with flexible hours that worked around my class schedule. "I need help with a study I'm conducting on small business resilience during economic downturns," he explained. "You've lived it. That's why I think you'll bring something unique to the project." For the first time, my struggle wasn't a liability. It was expertise. That research job changed everything. I still worked hard, but now my hours were filled with purpose, not panic. I helped collect data, reviewed case studies, sat in on interviews with local business owners. I learned more in those first few weeks than any textbook had ever taught me. Dr. Kapoor treated me like a colleague. He asked for my opinion, valued my input, and gave me space to grow. Every time he called me Ms. Carter with respect in his voice, it chipped away at the old story I'd been told about myself. That I wasn't the one worth betting on. With the extra income, I was able to drop the bookstore job and buy groceries without shame. I even splurged, once, on a real winter coat. Not fancy, just warm. Zoe noticed. "I've never seen you wear anything that didn't look like it survived a yard sale," she teased, handing me a cup of tea. "Still might have been from one," I smirked, "but it has insulation." She laughed, then got quiet. You know, Ava, you never stop moving. But I hope you let yourself feel what you've already survived. I didn't answer her right away, because she was right. I'd been racing so hard, so long, I hadn't stopped to recognize what I'd built, or how far I'd come since that night at the dinner table when my parents made their choice. But in that moment, tea in hand, snow falling softly against the windows, I felt something new. Not relief, not pride, something quieter, stronger, stability, and that, more than anything, felt like the beginning of power. There's something strange about the moment things stop being purely about survival. You don't notice it at first. It doesn't arrive with a banner or a sudden wind of clarity. It creeps in quietly, like the realization that the ground beneath you is no longer shaking. That's what the spring semester felt like. For the first time since arriving at Westbridge, I wasn't constantly bracing for disaster. I was still budgeting, still working, but I could breathe, think, dream. And that space made room for something I hadn't allowed myself to consider in a long time: possibility. Working alongside Dr. Kapoor on his small business resilience study opened my eyes. We were interviewing local entrepreneurs, people who ran cafes, flower shops, delivery services, businesses barely staying afloat through economic downturns, shifting markets, or even just rising rent. And yet, they persisted, adapted, reinvented. I started seeing patterns, pain points they all shared. Most couldn't afford marketing support or administrative help, and many struggled with digital tools. But they wanted to grow. They just didn't have the bandwidth. One night, as I was organizing our notes from an interview with a local pottery studio, an idea surfaced. What if I could help? Not with theory, not with lectures, but with real, practical services: branding, social media, scheduling, client communications, the stuff I already knew how to do because I'd had to do it for myself. That night, I stayed up until 2 a.m., scribbling in a half-used notebook, service ideas, pricing tiers, a name that didn't make me cringe. I wasn't building a company yet. I was building a possibility. Over the next few weeks, that notebook filled up. I started designing a simple website in the evenings after work, built entirely on free platforms and borrowed templates. I created a business email, wrote some draft copy. Then, deep breath, I posted a short ad in a local small business Facebook group under the name Summit Assist Co. I didn't expect a response. But 3 days later, I got one. A woman named Lynette, who ran a handmade jewelry store in downtown Boulder, needed someone to help her organize her inventory and set up an email newsletter. "I can't pay much," she wrote, "but I'm drowning." I took the job. We met at her store after hours. She looked surprised when I walked in, probably expecting someone older, but within 15 minutes we were clicking. I organized her files, helped her automate weekly email blasts, and walked her through scheduling posts on Instagram. It wasn't glamorous, but when she handed me a check at the end of the week, handwritten, with a note on the memo line that said "Lifesaver," something in me lit up. It grew from there. One client turned into 3, then 5. By April, I had a modest roster of local business owners who paid me small monthly fees to keep their digital lives in order. I kept my research job, of course, but now this was starting to feel like the future. More importantly, I felt like the future, for once not just reacting to what life threw at me, but creating something of my own. Dr. Kapoor noticed. "You've been more energized lately," he said one afternoon, glancing up from a spreadsheet. I told him, carefully, about the business. He listened. Then he smiled. "Entrepreneurship under pressure creates something remarkable. You've taken scarcity and turned it into strategy." That night, I sat in my tiny room, laptop open, watching my site's analytics in real time: 3 visitors, 1 inquiry, and 1 payment notification. It wasn't about the money. It was about the moment I realized I was no longer asking the world for permission. I was building my own seat at the table. It's a strange thing, realizing that the weight you've been carrying has started to turn into strength. By the time my sophomore year began at Westbridge, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was operating. With my research job, the small but steady income from Summit Assist Co., and the rhythms I had built, I finally had space to look up and speak up. Business strategy was the class that changed everything. It wasn't just another core requirement. It was where theories met reality, where case studies turned into open debates, and where students, for the first time, were expected to have opinions rooted in more than just textbooks. Most of my classmates came in with polished resumes, summer internships at family companies, or mentors with industry connections. I came in with lived experience and grit, and it showed. During a case study on resource allocation in startups, I raised my hand and shared how I'd structured packages for my small business clients to meet their needs without overextending myself. It was meant to be a quick comment. But the room went quiet. Then Professor Langley leaned forward, tapped her pen against the desk, and said, "Now that's real-world application." From that day forward, I wasn't invisible in class anymore. Students began asking to sit with me during group work. One even asked if I'd look over her pitch deck before submitting it for a competition. I didn't brag. I didn't try to prove anything. I just kept showing up, prepared, practical, and precise. Because I wasn't trying to impress anyone, I was trying to build something that lasted. Meanwhile, the contrast between Brooke's world and mine continued to deepen. She posted about campus formals, weekend getaways, and networking nights hosted by her sorority. When she called home, Mom would ask if she needed anything: new shoes, a dress for an event, a ride home for midterms. I never got those calls. Just the occasional group text from our parents that started with, "Hope everyone's doing well," and ended with, "Proud of you both," like the words were glued to a template. But I didn't need their pride anymore. I had proof. At the end of October, I was invited by Professor Langley to join a mentorship roundtable with local business leaders. 10 students selected across the entire school. I showed up in my cleanest blazer, borrowed from Zoe, and sat at a polished table surrounded by people whose job titles I had only read about online. And yet, I didn't feel out of place. When it came my turn to speak, I talked about Summit Assist, about juggling work, school, and clients, about how scarcity had made me sharper, not smaller. One of the guests, a partner at a consulting firm, leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You're not building a business," she said. "You're building a mindset." That sentence stuck with me. Later that night, I texted Grandma June and told her everything. She replied in 3 words, "Told you so." Then followed it with, "The world is finally seeing what I've always known." It wasn't a single moment that changed me. It was the slow accumulation of being seen, of being heard, and finally, of being taken seriously. And in the space where doubt used to live, something new was starting to bloom, not just confidence, but authority. I didn't expect the knock at the door. It was a rainy Tuesday in mid-November. I'd just gotten home from back-to-back classes and was preparing to pull a near all-nighter, finishing up a market analysis project for Dr. Kapoor. The sky outside was a dull slate, and the air in my apartment smelled faintly of instant ramen and fatigue. When I opened the door, I saw her, Brooke, standing there with damp hair, puffy eyes, and a laptop hugged to her chest. "I didn't know where else to go," she said softly. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. We hadn't spoken face-to-face in months, not because of any fight, but because there was simply distance, emotional, practical, and painfully real. I existed in a world of work, deadlines, and spreadsheets. She floated in one of Mixer's, student government meetings, and text chains with our parents I was never part of. She sat on the edge of the couch, her voice cracking. "I'm failing my senior thesis." She explained how her professor had torn apart her research proposal. Her argument was weak. Her sources were disorganized. She had 3 weeks to rewrite the whole thing or risk not graduating on time. "And I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her, unsure what to feel. Part of me remembered every moment she'd been lifted while I'd been ignored, every dollar spent on her future while mine had been left to chance. But another part, the part that still remembered braiding her hair when we were kids, walking her to class on her first day of middle school, that part softened. I took a breath. "Okay," I said. "Let's take a look." That night, for the first time in years, we sat side by side, our laptops open, notebooks spread across the table. I walked her through how to build a research framework, how to find reputable sources, how to structure her argument so that it actually held weight. She was frustrated, impatient, tense. And then, slowly, quiet. She watched me work, listened as I explained why certain sources wouldn't hold up in academic review, took notes as I helped her refine her core argument. "You're really good at this," she said, almost in awe. I didn't reply, not out of pride, but because I didn't know how to respond to finally being recognized. As the week wore on, our sessions continued. She brought coffee, I brought structure. Together, we chipped away at the mess she'd been handed, until, piece by piece, something whole began to emerge. One night, as we wrapped up another long study session, she looked at me and asked quietly, "How do you do all of this?" I blinked. "Do what?" "This. All of it. Your business, your classes, your job, helping me. I can barely keep up with one thing, and you're doing 5. I hesitated, then told her the truth, because no one else ever really asked. I told her about the hours, about the months I'd worked 60-hour weeks while juggling full course loads, about skipping meals, stretching paychecks, late-night spreadsheets, and tears I didn't have time to cry. She sat back, stunned. "Why didn't you say anything?" she whispered. I looked at her carefully. Would it have changed anything? That silence said everything. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something that had never existed between us before. Understanding. And in that understanding, the story between us quietly began to change. The thing about rebuilding a relationship, especially one splintered by years of silence and imbalance, is that it doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in layers, quiet gestures, small shifts, one conversation at a time. And that's how it was with Brooke. After our first study session, she kept showing up, sometimes with iced coffee, sometimes with an apology disguised as a joke, but always with a willingness I hadn't seen in her before. She started asking questions, not just about her thesis, but about me, about my work, my schedule, my business. And slowly, I let her in. One evening, as we walked back from campus after a late library session, she looked over at me, breath visible in the cold night air. "You know, I always thought you were just distant. But you weren't. You were just tired. And no one ever noticed." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because she finally had. By January, Brooke had finished her revised thesis proposal. Her professor approved it with glowing feedback, and the relief on her face was real, earned. But something else had shifted too. She started turning down offers from our parents, said she'd rather figure things out on her own. "They don't even realize how lopsided it's been," she admitted one day. "And maybe they never will, but I can't keep pretending it didn't cost you something." She still called home more often than I did, but now she mentioned me in those conversations. She pushed back when they brushed past my name, and for the first time, it felt like I had an ally on the inside. Meanwhile, my world was moving fast. Summit Assist Company had gone from a side hustle to a real business. I had 8 regular clients now, local artisans, a yoga studio, a bakery, even a small landscaping company. I hired a classmate part-time to help with scheduling and social media content. My once scattered notebook was now a full business plan, a living, breathing operation. And then, in early February, Professor Langley invited me into her office after class. "I've submitted your name to the dean," she said, eyes gleaming. "Each year, the business school nominates one student to speak at graduation. I think your story could inspire a lot of people." My heart skipped, not just because of the honor, but because someone had called it a story, like it had weight, like it mattered. Around the same time, I received an email from Business Insight Weekly, a digital publication known for profiling young entrepreneurs. They wanted to feature me in their spring edition. "Your name came up during a panel," the editor wrote. "We were told you're someone to watch." I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't believe it, but because for the first time, someone outside my small circle believed it too. And that was new. Zoe threw her arms around me when she heard. "I told you," she said, beaming. "You're not just building a business, you're building a legacy." Even Brooke teared up when I told her about the nomination. "You deserve this," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Recognition didn't erase the past, but it added something new to the present: validation. Not just from professors or publications, but from people I never thought would understand, including the sister I once thought I'd lost forever. Some moments come quietly, others arrive like a drumbeat. That spring, everything in my life seemed to move with rhythm, urgent, deliberate, inevitable. I wasn't just preparing for finals. I was preparing to stand on a stage and speak to thousands as the student representative of the Westbridge School of Business. And every time I practiced the speech, alone, in my room, in front of Zoe, in hushed corners of the library, it felt a little more real, a little heavier, a little more like closure. In March, my email pinged with news I almost couldn't believe. I'd made it to the final round of the statewide Business Innovation Competition, a prestigious event where students from across Colorado pitched their ventures to panels of investors and business leaders. The grand prize? $50,000 in funding and national exposure. Dr. Kapoor found me in the hallway and handed me a printed copy of my application. "I knew you had a shot," he said. "But this is major." So I doubled down. I spent nights rehearsing my pitch, refining my numbers, and rewriting slide decks until my eyes blurred. Brooke helped where she could, offering feedback and sitting through mock presentations with the kind of focus I never imagined she had. We weren't just sisters now. We were collaborators, partners. She even joked, "When you're famous, I'll be your publicist." As the competition drew closer, so did graduation. Our parents, of course, began making plans. They rented a house near campus to host extended family for the weekend. Brooke told me about the group texts flying back and forth, menus, outfits, party supplies. I asked if I was included in any of it. She looked uncomfortable. "They assumed you'd be too busy." I nodded. I was, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. The week before the competition, I received a manila envelope from the dean's office. Inside was the official notice of my selection as the graduation speaker, and something else. A personal note from Dean Alvarez herself. "Your journey reflects the spirit we hope to cultivate in every student: resilience, innovation, and the courage to carve your own path. We're honored to have you represent the class of 2025. I reread that sentence 3 times. Then once more, just for the girl I had been 4 years ago. 2 days before the pitch event, I got a call from the competition director. They wanted me to go last. "Final spot in the final round," she said. "Best for audience energy and press timing." I agreed, heart pounding. Later that night, I told Zoe and Brooke. Zoe hugged me like she was trying to transfer strength through her arms. "Brooke?" She smiled through teary eyes. "You're not just proving them wrong anymore," she whispered. "You're proving yourself right." I didn't know it then, but the speech I was preparing, the pitch I was finalizing, the recognition I was about to receive, it would all converge on one unforgettable stage. where the people who once dismissed me would be forced to watch what they never saw coming. The auditorium at Denver Civic Hall was colder than I expected. Rows of polished seats stretched into shadowed corners. Bright stage lights burned above the podium, casting long, theatrical shadows across the wood-paneled walls. The energy in the air was electric, ambition humming from every corner. I was the last speaker of the day. Final slot. Final pitch. It was exactly what I wanted. And still, the weight of it pressed against my ribs. Backstage, I stood alone, hands clenched, heart rattling. My slide deck was ready. My notes were tight. I'd rehearsed this pitch more times than I could count, but something about this moment made me feel like I was standing at the edge of a cliff I'd built with my own hands. Zoe had texted me 5 minutes earlier. "You've already won. Now show them why." And Brooke? She sent a photo, me on stage during one of my class presentations. The caption read, "This is just another classroom, only this time, the whole room's listening." Then the MC's voice echoed, "Our final presenter is Ava Carter, founder of Summit Assist Co., a student-led business transforming how local entrepreneurs grow and thrive." Applause followed, not polite, eager. I stepped into the light. My heels clicked softly across the stage. I looked out at the sea of unfamiliar faces, investors, faculty, business leaders, and at least 2 local reporters seated in the front row. I spotted my parents. They'd arrived late, sitting stiffly in the back corner. I didn't wave, but I saw them. And for once, I didn't flinch. I began with a story, a real one. I didn't start Summit Assist in a moment of inspiration. I started it in a moment of necessity. I was a broke college student trying to survive, working 2 jobs, managing full-time classes, and building systems out of sheer desperation. And along the way, I realized I wasn't alone. Small business owners all around me were drowning in tasks that pulled them away from what they did best. I clicked to the next slide, clean visuals, real testimonials. I didn't want to sell them perfection. I wanted to give them capacity, the space to breathe, to grow, to succeed without burning out. As I walked the judges through case studies, financial growth, and future expansion plans, I felt a shift in the room. Heads nodded, pens scribbled, eyes widened, not in surprise, but in respect. They didn't see a student. They saw a founder. I closed with a quiet conviction. I didn't have a safety net. I had grit. I had Google. I had nights where I cried into spreadsheets and mornings where I got back up anyway. And that spirit, that resilience, is what built Summit Assist. And it's why I'm standing here now. The room was silent for a breath. Then it erupted. Applause. Real. Loud. Sustained. I stood still, hands clasped, absorbing it, not as validation from others, but as proof to myself. I didn't need to be chosen. I had chosen myself long ago. As I stepped off the stage, the panelists were already leaning in to speak with the coordinator. One of them caught my eye and mouthed, "Well done." Brooke was waiting just beyond the curtain. Tears streaked her cheeks. "You owned that stage," she said, voice cracking. "I've never been prouder." And behind her, awkward and hesitant, stood my parents. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but for once, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let them sit in it, let them feel the weight of what they'd almost missed. Because for the first time, the girl they'd overlooked was the woman they couldn't ignore. The hours after the competition passed in a blur. People I didn't know, judges, fellow contestants, local business owners, kept approaching me backstage, shaking my hand, asking questions, slipping me business cards with gold lettering and embossed logos. I kept smiling, nodding, answering, but inside I was still standing on that stage, still hearing the echo of applause that wasn't polite or obligatory, it was earned. The panel didn't announce the results until the closing ceremony that evening. Everyone gathered again in the auditorium, dressed in slightly stiffer clothes and carrying a different kind of tension. When they called my name as the grand prize winner, I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe. Not until Zoe screamed and threw her arms around me like we'd just crossed a finish line she'd been running with me the whole time. Brooke clapped so hard her palms turned red. My parents? They stood. They clapped. But their eyes held something new. Not confusion. Not guilt. It was awe. After the ceremony, I found myself face to face with my mom and dad for the first time in what felt like years. Your presentation was impressive, Dad said. Really impressive. Mom nodded slowly. We didn't know how much you had taken on. I could have listed it for them then. Every missed call, every dollar I never asked for, every lonely milestone I'd crossed alone. But I didn't, because what I needed now wasn't pity, it was clarity. So I just said, I didn't tell you, because I knew you weren't listening. They looked stunned, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Brooke slipped her hand into mine, grounding me. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. For the first time, the silence belonged to me. Later that night, after the crowd thinned and the stage lights dimmed, I stepped outside into the cool Denver air. The city buzzed around me, horns in the distance, conversations floating from sidewalk cafes, stars barely visible above the glow. My phone buzzed. An email from Bloom Ventures, a startup incubator in San Francisco. They'd seen a clip of my pitch and wanted to set up a meeting. I laughed out loud, alone under a street lamp. Not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. I walked back to the rental house where our family was staying. Brooke had left the porch light on. Inside, she'd arranged takeout containers into a celebratory buffet. Thai noodles, spring rolls, strawberry cheesecake. Small wins deserve sweet things, she said with a wink. I sat beside her on the floor, heels kicked off, heart full in a way I didn't know I was allowed to feel. Recognition from strangers was validating, but recognition from yourself, from the version of you that never gave up? That was something else entirely, and as I leaned back against the couch, watching laughter fill the room I once felt erased from, I realized this wasn't just a turning point, it was the beginning of a new story. One I got to write. One they couldn't rewrite. Returning to Westbridge after the competition felt different. The buildings were the same. The campus buzzed with the usual spring energy, finals stress, graduation announcements, couples holding hands under blooming dogwoods. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't just passing through these halls anymore. I had left a mark. Word of my pitch had made its way around campus faster than I expected. Professors I'd never spoken to before stopped me in the corridor. Classmates I barely knew offered congratulations. Even the campus newspaper asked for an interview. Front page with the headline, Ava Carter redefines resilience. I smiled when I saw it, not because it proved anything to anyone else, but because the girl who used to hide behind her laptop in the library had finally stepped into the light. Then came the harder part, writing my graduation speech. It was due in 5 days, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to condense 4 years of survival, heartbreak, and hard-won growth into 5 polished minutes. I sat at my desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Where do you start when your story doesn't sound like anyone else's? Where do you begin when no one expected you to make it this far? Zoe popped her head into my room that night, her usual bundle of chaos and support. Still blank? She asked, nudging a mug of tea toward me. I nodded. Everything I write sounds too clean, too polished. That's not how it happened. She sat beside me and said gently, Then don't make it sound clean. Tell the truth. Your truth. So I started again. Not with a quote, not with a list of achievements, but with a sentence I never thought I'd say out loud. I didn't get here the easy way, but I got here anyway. From there, the words began to flow. I wrote about the nights I worked until 3 a.m., the ramen dinners, the self-doubt, the way I learned to ask for nothing and still find ways to rise. I wrote about Grandma June's voice in my head, about Zoe's couch when I had nowhere else to go, about the clients who trusted me when I still doubted myself. I wrote for the students sitting in the back row, silent, tired, wondering if anyone saw them. I wrote for the version of me that once thought resilience meant being invisible. Brooke read the draft 2 nights before the ceremony. She didn't speak for a long time after she finished. Then she looked up and said, This is going to move people." I smiled softly. I hope it frees someone. The night before graduation, I walked the stage in the empty auditorium. Just me, the janitor sweeping the aisles, and the quiet hum of possibility. I stood at the podium and whispered the opening lines under my breath. The lights were off, the chairs were empty, but I didn't feel alone. I felt ready. The morning of graduation broke warm and golden. Sunlight poured through my apartment window like it knew what kind of day it was. The air smelled of blooming lilacs and last chances. For the first time in a long time, I woke up without the weight of survival pressing against my chest. I'd made it. Not by chance, not by privilege, but by choice. And persistence. And every late night and quiet no turned into a louder yes. Zoe helped me with my hair, pinning it up neatly under the cap. Brooke showed up early, holding a small bouquet of sunflowers and a tearful grin that barely held steady. "You ready?" she asked. I took a breath. As I'll ever be. The campus lawn was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the green, graduates in navy robes, proud families with phones raised, and an elevated stage draped in school banners under a white canopy. I found my seat with the other honorees. My name card was crisp, the paper thick and glossy, like it was finally meant to be there. Dean Alvarez opened the ceremony with the usual welcome. Speeches followed, some inspiring, some rehearsed. Then, my name echoed through the speakers. "Please welcome our student speaker, Ava Carter." The applause was warm, rising across the crowd in waves. I walked to the podium, my speech folded in my hand, my heartbeat louder than anything else in the moment. And then I looked up. There they were, my parents, seated in the front row. My mom clutched her purse tightly, lips pressed together, trying not to cry. My dad leaned forward just slightly, like he didn't want to miss a word. Brooke caught my eye and gave the tiniest nod. I unfolded the paper, smiled once, and spoke. "I didn't get here the easy way, but I got here anyway." A pause. "I know what it feels like to wonder if you'll make it, to do everything right, and still feel like you're standing on the outside of a story that was never written for you." I let the words breathe. I know what it feels like to be told, not now, not yet, or worse, nothing at all. Murmurs in the crowd. A few heads bowed. Others sat straighter. But I also know what it feels like to find your way anyway, to build your own ladder when no one lowers one for you. I told them about Summit Assist, about late-night ramen and missed birthdays, about the quiet resilience of creating something from scraps and turning it into something solid, something real. I didn't name names. I didn't call out my parents. But I didn't hide either. I told the truth, not for revenge, but for every student sitting quietly in their own version of my seat 4 years ago. And when I ended the speech, I didn't raise my voice. I lowered it to a hush. To anyone who ever felt unseen, this diploma, this stage, this moment, it's proof. You were always enough, even when no one said it. The silence afterward lasted half a breath too long. Then the crowd erupted, not just polite applause, but a standing ovation. As I stepped down, I passed my parents. They stood too. My mom's eyes were red. My dad mouthed something. Maybe, "Thank you," maybe, "I'm sorry." I didn't stop. Not out of anger, but because I wasn't the girl who needed their approval anymore. The ceremony ended with a swirl of camera flashes, hugs, and flying caps. Everyone seemed to be rushing somewhere. Families to dinner reservations, friends to rooftop parties, professors to post-event receptions. But I just stood there for a while, in the middle of it all. The applause had stopped. The stage was empty. And yet, I had never felt so full. Brooke found me near the edge of the lawn, where the crowd thinned out and the air felt less like celebration and more like stillness. She wrapped her arms around me before I could say a word. "You did it," she whispered. "And you didn't hold back." I nodded, pulling away just enough to look at her. "Neither did you. Thank you for standing with me." She smiled, eyes glassy. "Always." Our parents came over a moment later, cautiously, like they weren't sure how close they were allowed to stand. My mom held out a small velvet box. Inside was a necklace. Simple. A delicate gold chain with a small charm shaped like a mountain peak. "We saw it and thought of you," she said, her voice tight. "Because you climbed one," Dad added. I stared at the charm, unsure what to feel. A part of me wanted to hand it back. Another part wanted to believe maybe this gesture meant something. Maybe they were trying, even if it was late. "I appreciate it," I said softly, then tucked it into my bag without putting it on. They didn't press, and that in itself was new. That night, the three of us, Zoe, Brooke, and I, sat on the rooftop of our apartment building with takeout and a bottle of cheap champagne we drank straight from the bottle. The city lights sparkled below us. Laughter floated up from neighboring patios. My heels were kicked off, my robe draped over the railing. Zoe raised the bottle in a toast. "To the girl who built something from nothing and made it unforgettable." Brooke added, "To the woman who didn't wait to be chosen, who chose herself." We clinked plastic cups, and as I took a sip, I felt something settle in me. Not pride, not relief, but peace. The next morning, I woke up to 3 emails in a row. One from Bloom Ventures, confirming a second interview. One from the local Chamber of Commerce, asking me to keynote their summer conference. And one from Forbes U30, asking for a profile interview. I sat in bed, reading each one twice. Not because I was shocked, but because it no longer felt surreal. It felt aligned. I closed my laptop and stared out the window. The mountain peaks in the distance looked softer in the morning haze, familiar but different. Like they were waiting, not for permission, but for a decision. For so long, success to me meant survival. It meant scraping by, proving people wrong, making noise just to be noticed. But now, I wasn't chasing applause anymore. I was choosing direction. I was building something lasting, something that didn't need to scream to be seen. The days after graduation slipped by in a quiet, golden blur. Boxes lined the edges of my apartment, some labeled keep, others marked donate. But most just sat there, half-filled, like they couldn't decide what they wanted to be yet. I knew the feeling. On paper, things were clear. Bloom Ventures had offered me a position in San Francisco, a full ride through their accelerator program, plus a stipend, housing, and access to investors I'd only ever read about in magazine features. Every mentor I had told me I'd be crazy not to take it. Even Zoe, between bites of leftover pizza, said, "This is the door people dream of knocking on, and they're holding it open for you." She wasn't wrong. It was the offer that changes everything. But still, I kept hesitating. I walked the streets of Boulder, where my business was born. Every cafe I passed, every corner bookstore or yoga studio. It wasn't just scenery. It was evidence. Proof of every step, every struggle, every risk that built Summit Assist from an idea into something real. And I wondered, could I really leave this behind? One evening, I sat on a bench near Flatiron Park as the sun dipped low behind the mountains. My journal lay open on my lap, but the page was still blank. Brooke called. "You've been quiet," she said gently. "I'm thinking," I replied. "About?" I paused, then said it out loud for the first time. Whether home is where you build or where you're needed next. She didn't answer right away. Then softly, maybe it's both. That night, I walked into the Summit Assist office, still a shared co-working space with creaky floors and too much natural light. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the plan I'd been too scared to finalize. A national expansion model, clients in Seattle, Austin, Chicago. The plan was there. All it needed was me. I didn't sleep much, but the next morning I knew. San Francisco wasn't about leaving. It was about scaling. I could stay rooted in who I was and still stretch into who I was becoming. I called Bloom Ventures, accepted the offer, booked the flight. Zoe screamed. Brooke cried. My parents were oddly quiet. Maybe scared, maybe proud, maybe both. But I didn't wait for their reaction this time. I had my answer. 2 days later, I mailed a box to the new office address. Inside was my grandmother's old planner, a tiny framed photo of Zoe and me from our first apartment, and a sticky note that read, "Start where you are, build what you need, leave space to grow." Because leaving doesn't mean losing, and starting over doesn't mean starting from scratch. Sometimes the only way forward is to go. San Francisco was louder than I expected. The city pulsed, horns echoing off hills, the whir of cable cars, the buzz of 1,000 startup conversations drifting from every cafe corner. It was beautiful, chaotic, wild with possibility. And, for the first few days, deeply overwhelming. My new apartment sat on the edge of the Mission District, a one-bedroom walk-up with crooked baseboards and sunlight that poured through the windows like it was trying to convince me I belonged there. I unpacked slowly, one memory at a time. The framed photo of Zoe and me found its place on my desk. Grandma June's planner rested by the window. The mountain necklace from my parents? Still tucked in the drawer. Close, but not quite ready to wear. Bloom Ventures was everything it promised. Polished glass offices, high-speed Wi-Fi, mentors with portfolios that spanned continents. Each founder in the cohort was brilliant, hungry, and just as scared as I was. On our first day, we sat in a circle and introduced ourselves. When it was my turn, I stood up, heart pounding, and said, "My name's Ava Carter. I bootstrapped my company from my dorm room, and I'm here to learn how to build something that lasts longer than me." The room nodded. They understood. But understanding didn't make it easy. The pressure came fast. Deadlines, pitches, investor meetings. One mentor told me, "You're smart, but if you want to grow, you need to stop working in your business and start working on it." I nodded like I understood. But that night, I stared at my screen until 2 a.m., trying to delegate tasks I'd never trusted anyone else to handle. Some days, I felt like a fraud, like the girl who had walked across that graduation stage in Boulder was still somewhere back in Colorado while I was here, just trying not to drown in ambition. But other days, I remembered. The ramen nights, the borrowed couches, the clients who sent thank you notes that read, "You gave me my weekends back." I held on to those. Brooke called every Sunday. Zoe sent me memes and voice notes almost daily. And even my mom started texting small updates, pictures of her garden, my dad fixing the garage, little snapshots of life continuing quietly back home. It helped. Not because I needed permission anymore, but because staying connected didn't mean staying small. The first real breakthrough came in week 6. I'd landed a contract with a chain of independent coffee shops along the West Coast. 20 new clients in one proposal. It was ambitious, risky, but real. My team at Bloom cheered like I'd won the Super Bowl, and for the first time since landing in San Francisco, I let myself feel it. The pride, the weight, the wild, fragile joy of growth. That night, I walked to the top of Bernal Hill, the city glittering below. I thought about the girl who once believed success meant being seen. And I smiled. Because now, success felt like expansion. Of mind, of mission, of what I thought was possible. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was halfway through a call with a potential investor when I noticed the unread email sitting in my inbox. Subject line, "Would love to reconnect." I clicked it instinctively, then froze. It was from Professor Daniels, the same economics professor who once dismissed my business idea as too narrow and unrealistic. The same professor who suggested I focus on something more fitting for someone with limited resources. I stared at the message for a long time. "Hi, Ava. I recently read about your success with Summit Assist. I'm truly impressed. I was wrong not to see your potential years ago. If you're open to it, I'd love to invite you to guest speak at Westbridge next month. Our students could learn a lot from your journey. Warmly, Tom Daniels." The irony landed with a thud in my chest. He hadn't believed in me when it mattered. And now? Now he wanted me to stand in front of a room full of students, his students, and serve as the inspiration I was never allowed to be in his class. I closed my laptop, walked to the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the fog roll over Twin Peaks. My fingers itched to delete the email, to pretend it never came. But somewhere underneath the heat in my chest was a quieter voice. Not angry, just steady. This isn't about him. This is about you. That night, I called Brooke, told her everything. She didn't interrupt, just listened. When I was done, she said, "You have every right to say no. But maybe the real win here isn't walking away. Maybe it's walking in and owning the room that once tried to shrink you." I didn't answer right away, but I knew she was right. The next morning, I replied to the email. "Professor Daniels, thank you for reaching out. I accept the invitation. Let me know the date and time. Ava. Simple, clear, no emotion, no apology needed." 2 weeks later, I stepped off a flight in Denver and drove the familiar highway back to Westbridge. It was strange how small the campus looked now. Same buildings, same benches, same long staircase near the quad. But I wasn't the same. The lecture hall was packed when I arrived. Students buzzed in hushed whispers. Daniels greeted me with an awkward half-smile and a weak handshake. I stood at the front of the room, took a breath, and began. I was told once that my idea was too small, that my circumstances were a limitation, not a foundation. A pause. But the truth is, everything I built, every piece of Summit Assist, came from exactly those limitations. I didn't have access. I had imagination. I didn't have wealth. I had grit. As I spoke, I watched the faces of students shift, leaning forward, eyes wide, not with pity, but curiosity, engagement, recognition. I told them the truth, the failures, the wins, the fear, and the choice to show up anyway. Afterward, Daniels approached me again. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You proved me wrong." I nodded once, but what I wanted to say was this. I didn't do it to prove you wrong. I did it to prove myself right. Because healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet return to the place where you were once underestimated, and standing there with your full, undeniable self. The flight back to San Francisco felt different this time. Not rushed, not anxious, not even triumphant, just still. Like my heart had finally caught up with my body. I stared out the airplane window as the city lights below sharpened into view, tiny sparks dotting the fog like pieces of a life I'd stitched together from nothing but intention and persistence. When we landed, I didn't rush for my phone. I didn't check emails. I just breathed, because something had shifted. Not around me, within me. The next morning, I walked to the Summit Assist office before the sun was fully up. The city was quiet, the streets slick from a light rain, the scent of eucalyptus and sea air mixing like some kind of fresh beginning. Inside, the office was dim, except for the warm hum of the entry lights and the soft beeping of my coffee machine. I sat at my desk, opened my journal, and wrote just one line. "This is my legacy, and I'm living it. One breath, one choice at a time." Over the next few weeks, I didn't scale back. I expanded differently, with more intention. I built out our wellness division, hired new team leads from underserved communities, and launched a mentorship program for first-generation college students with business ideas of their own. And I did something I never thought I'd be ready for. I called my dad, not to confront, not to rehash, just to reconnect. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing and everything: weather, Brooke's new job, the way my mom kept sending photos of their overgrown tomatoes. It wasn't closure, but it was a start. On the first anniversary of my move to San Francisco, I stood on the same rooftop where Zoe and I had once toasted with cheap champagne. This time she was visiting for real, curled up beside me in a hoodie, barefoot and smiling. "You ever think," she said, "about how different everything could have been if you hadn't said yes to yourself back then?" I nodded. All the time. And then I raised my glass, this time filled with something a little nicer, and said the words I never thought I'd say out loud. I'm proud of me. Not because of the money, or the articles, or the way Professor Daniels now cited my work in his lectures, but because I stayed true to the version of myself that refused to shrink, even when no one clapped. I built my own applause. And now I build it for others. So if you're listening to this and you feel like the invisible one, the one passed over, the one underestimated, the one holding your breath while others get the spotlight, please hear this. Your worth is not up for debate. You don't need permission to start. You don't need a perfect plan. You just need one choice, one step, one moment of bravery that belongs only to you. If my story has meant something to you, even in a small way, I'd love to hear it in the comments. And if you believe more people need to hear voices like mine, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep building this space for those still finding the courage to speak. You're not alone. Not anymore.